My father built his empire with a surveyor's level and a stubborn refusal to die poor. And his widow started dismantling it before the flowers on his casket had even wilted. My name is Thomas Livingston. I'm 35 years old. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and for most of my life, I believed that hard work eventually reveals people's true character. What I learned in the spring of 2024 was that greed reveals it much faster. My father, Robert Livingston, wasn't born wealthy. Everything he owned came from years of sweat, risk, and persistence. He started with an old pickup truck, a small loan from my grandfather, and enough determination to outwork anyone around him. Over 4 decades, he built Livingston General Contractors into one of the most respected construction firms in central Arizona. More than 100 employees depended on that company. Many of them had spent most of their careers working beside him. To my father, the business wasn't just an asset. It was a responsibility. That's why his death hit so many people so hard, including me. When he passed away in March of 2024, I felt like a foundation had suddenly disappeared beneath my feet. No matter how old you are, losing a parent changes something inside you. The world feels different afterward. Quieter, less certain. I barely remember the first few days after his death. The funeral. The visitors, the endless condolences, everything blurred together. One thing I do remember clearly was Sandra, my father's wife, my stepmother. She cried when people expected tears, thanked guests when they approached, accepted sympathy with perfect composure. She looked exactly like a grieving widow should look. At the time, I told myself I was lucky. Many families fall apart after a death. Maybe ours wouldn't. I was wrong. 2 days after the funeral, an email arrived. The sender was an estate attorney I had never met. The subject line contained my father's name. I opened it immediately. By the second paragraph, my stomach had gone cold. According to the email, my father's most recent will named Sandra as the sole beneficiary of his estate. The house, the accounts, the company, everything. The message ended with a polite request for me to collect any personal belongings from the family residence within 5 business days. 5 days. My father had been buried less than 48 hours earlier. I read the email again. Then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I couldn't believe how quickly it had happened. Most people would have exploded, argued, threatened lawsuits, demanded answers. Instead, I poured a cup of coffee and sat quietly at my kitchen table. Because something about the situation felt wrong. Not unfair, wrong. My father was many things. Stubborn, demanding, old-fashioned. But he wasn't careless. He spent his entire life planning for worst-case scenarios. The idea that he'd leave everything exposed without a backup plan didn't fit the man I knew. That instinct led me to make one phone call. Kevin Mercer, my father's longtime attorney. He answered on the second ring. Thomas, he said. His voice sounded almost relieved. I was expecting your call. That sentence immediately got my attention. I sat up straighter. What aren't you telling me? There was a pause. Then Kevin spoke carefully. Your father came to see me 6 months before he died. The room suddenly felt very quiet. He was concerned about something, Kevin continued. He asked me to help him put protections in place. Protections, not inheritance plans. Protections. At that moment, I realized something important. My father had seen a problem coming long before anyone else did. And whatever he had done, Sandra clearly didn't know about it. The next morning, I drove downtown to Kevin's office. And by the time I left, I understood why my father had spent months preparing for a battle he knew he would never live to see. Kevin spread several documents across his desk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The morning sunlight poured through the office windows, reflecting off the glass towers of downtown Phoenix. My father's attorney looked tired, not overwhelmed, prepared. Like a man who had been waiting months for a conversation he always knew would eventually happen. Your father didn't just write a will, Thomas, he said. He built a contingency plan. I leaned forward. What does that mean? Kevin slid a thick binder across the desk. Inside were trust agreements, transfer records, corporate filings, and dozens of documents bearing my father's signature. At first, it looked like legal nonsense. Then I started reading, and my pulse slowed, because suddenly everything made sense. 6 months before his death, my father had quietly restructured Livingston General Contractors. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, methodically. The way he approached everything important, the company Sandra thought she was inheriting, no longer existed in the form she imagined. The equipment, the contracts, the operating accounts, the properties, the licenses, the workforce, all of it had been transferred into a protected trust structure. Legally, cleanly, completely. Sandra wasn't listed as a beneficiary. I was. For several seconds, I simply stared at the documents, not because I was excited, because I realized my father had seen this coming. Long before I did. Long before Sandra realized he knew. Then Kevin handed me something else. A letter, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. The sight of it hit me harder than the legal documents. I unfolded the page carefully. The first line nearly broke me. "Thomas, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone." I had to stop for a moment. My father wasn't an emotional writer. He wasn't a man who expressed himself easily. Every word mattered because he rarely wasted them. The letter wasn't long, but every sentence carried weight. He explained that he had become concerned about irregularities inside the business. Vendor invoices that didn't make sense, expenses that couldn't be justified, money moving in ways that troubled him. He didn't directly accuse Sandra, but he didn't have to. The implication was obvious. Then came the line I still remember word for word. "I love Sandra, but I trust this company to you." I sat quietly after finishing the letter. My father had built that company from nothing, and now he was trusting me to protect it, not for myself, for the employees, for the families, for the legacy. 3 days later, the official estate transfer meeting was scheduled. Sandra arrived looking confident, almost relaxed. She wore a black designer suit and carried herself like someone who already knew the outcome. Her attorney sat beside her, a polished man with silver hair and the calm confidence of someone expecting an easy victory. When the meeting began, the will was read aloud. Every major asset appeared exactly as Sandra expected. The house, the personal accounts, the company, everything. I watched her expression carefully. She wasn't celebrating openly, but I noticed the small smile, the private one, the smile people wear when they think they've won. Then came the transfer paperwork, the detailed asset disclosures, the documents nobody had bothered to examine closely beforehand. And suddenly the room changed. Sandra's attorney stopped reading. His eyes returned to the page. Then he read it again. His confidence disappeared so quickly, it was almost painful to watch. The company Sandra had inherited contained nothing. No equipment, no active contracts, no employees, no properties, no receivables, no operating funds, nothing. Just a corporate shell. The name, the logo, the letterhead, that was all. Everything of actual value had already been transferred months earlier, legally, properly, completely. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sandra leaned forward. "What does that mean?" Her attorney didn't answer immediately, because he already knew, and so did I. The company she believed she controlled had no company inside it. The realization hit her slowly. First confusion, then disbelief, then panic. Real panic. The kind people experience when a plan they've spent years building suddenly collapses. She turned toward me. "What did you do?" I looked directly at her, and for the first time since my father's funeral, I felt completely calm. "I didn't do anything," I said. "My father did." If you've ever watched someone underestimate a quiet person because they confused kindness with weakness, subscribe, because the smartest people rarely announce their plans. The meeting continued. The transfer remained valid. Sandra received exactly what the will promised. Nothing less, nothing more. But the surprises weren't over. Because once accountants began examining records connected to the estate, a trail started emerging. And that trail was leading somewhere Sandra never expected. Straight back to her. The weeks after the hearing were surprisingly quiet, at least on the surface. Sandra had inherited exactly what the will promised: the house, the personal accounts, and an empty company shell carrying a familiar name. But beneath that silence, something else was happening. The accountants were digging. Every transfer, every invoice, every payment, every financial record connected to the company was being reviewed. And what they found changed everything. The same questionable invoices I had raised concerns about years earlier suddenly became impossible to ignore. Vendor payments led to businesses that barely existed. Money trails led through multiple accounts. And eventually those trails pointed toward Sandra. Not once, not twice, repeatedly. Over the following months, lawyers and forensic accountants examined thousands of pages of records. The numbers told a story that no amount of explanation could erase. Money had been leaving the company long before my father died, far more than anyone realized. When Sandra's legal team finally understood what was happening, their strategy changed immediately. The aggressive threats disappeared. The demands stopped, and settlement discussions began. If you've ever watched someone spend months chasing an inheritance only to discover they were running straight toward their own mistakes, subscribe, because the truth has a way of waiting patiently. In the end, Sandra agreed to walk away. She kept the house. She kept the personal accounts. And she gave up every claim to the trust, the operating business, and the future of Livingston General Contractors. The fight was over. Not because someone won, because my father had already finished it before he died. A few weeks later, I stood at one of our active construction sites just outside Phoenix. Steel beams stretched into the afternoon sky. Machinery moved across freshly graded earth. Workers shouted measurements across the site. The same sounds my father had spent his life listening to. I stood there for a long time, thinking about him, thinking about what he had built and what he had protected. My father didn't leave me millions. He left me something far more valuable: responsibility. The company survived. The employees kept their jobs. The projects stayed on schedule. And the legacy he spent 40 years building remained intact. Every Saturday morning, I still make scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and black coffee. No butter. Just heat and patience. Exactly the way my father taught me. Because some inheritances aren't written into wills. They're built one careful decision at a time. And thanks to him, that legacy is still standing.